In this episode, we take a step into the kind of thinking that makes security engineering feel like real engineering instead of a collection of scattered controls. Structural security design principles are the ideas that shape a system's foundation so that common failure patterns are less likely to happen in the first place. Beginners often learn security as a set of threats and defenses, like learning the names of storms and the types of umbrellas. But security engineering also includes designing the building so it does not collapse when the weather gets rough. The exam expects you to recognize that many security failures are predictable, not because attackers are magical, but because systems repeat the same structural mistakes over and over. When a system trusts too much, exposes too much, centralizes too much power, or makes change uncontrolled, you get the same outcomes: unauthorized access, data leakage, tampering, outages, and a loss of confidence. Structural principles are the counterweight to those patterns because they guide you to build boundaries, reduce hidden assumptions, and create evidence that the system behaves as intended. Our goal here is to make these principles understandable in plain language and to show how they prevent failure modes you will see repeatedly in scenarios. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful way to understand structural principles is to separate them from specific tools or configurations. A principle is a design rule of thumb that stays useful even when the technology changes, because it is about how systems behave, not about what brand or product is used. Structural principles are not just nice ideas. They are responses to the way complex systems fail under pressure, including pressure from attackers, accidents, and everyday operational chaos. When a principle is missing, failure becomes more likely, and the failure often looks familiar, like an overly trusted internal network leading to lateral movement, or a single privileged account leading to catastrophic misuse. The exam often presents situations where something went wrong and asks what should have been done differently, and structural principles give you a strong answer because they address root causes. If you learn the principles, you gain a reliable way to reason even when the scenario details are new. That is the power of structure. It travels across contexts. One of the most important structural principles is least privilege because it limits damage when something goes wrong. Least privilege means every user, process, and component has only the access needed to perform its intended function and no more. The predictable failure mode it prevents is over-permissioning, where a compromise of one account or one service becomes a compromise of the entire system. Over-permissioning is common because it makes systems easier to operate in the short term, but it creates hidden risk that becomes visible only during an incident. Structurally, least privilege also encourages better design because it forces you to define roles, responsibilities, and boundaries more clearly. When least privilege is applied, the system becomes more predictable because actions are constrained and can be monitored against known expectations. On the exam, answers that apply least privilege tend to be strong when the scenario involves broad access, shared accounts, or unclear separation between administrative and routine functions. Closely related is the principle of separation of duties, which is about preventing a single person or single component from having enough power to abuse the system without oversight. Separation of duties does not mean people cannot do their jobs. It means critical actions require independent checks or distinct roles, especially for actions that could create large harm, like changing access rules, approving deployments, or modifying audit records. The predictable failure mode it prevents is silent misuse, whether accidental or intentional, because no single actor can both cause and conceal the damage easily. In systems, separation of duties can show up as distinct administrative roles, staged approvals, or separating development from production operations. Beginners sometimes assume this is only a policy concept, but structurally it affects how systems and processes are designed, because you need clear boundaries and traceable actions. Exam scenarios that involve fraud, insider risk, or repeated unauthorized changes often point toward missing separation of duties and weak accountability. When you see an environment where one role can do everything, you should consider whether the system is structurally asking for trouble. Another structural principle is defense in depth, which means you do not rely on a single control to prevent failure. Instead, you use multiple layers of protection so that if one layer fails, others still reduce risk. The predictable failure mode it prevents is the single point of security failure, where one misconfiguration or one weakness creates a direct path to critical assets. Defense in depth is sometimes misunderstood as adding as many controls as possible, but structural defense in depth is about placing different kinds of controls at different points in the system, especially at trust boundaries and around high-value functions. A layered approach might include authentication and authorization at entry points, validation at interfaces, segmentation between components, monitoring for unusual activity, and recovery planning if disruption occurs. The exam often tests whether you can choose a layered strategy rather than a single fix, particularly when the scenario suggests that failures can happen despite best efforts. A layered mindset also makes your reasoning more mature because it acknowledges that perfection is unrealistic. Fail-safe defaults is a principle that sounds simple, but it prevents many real-world security failures. It means that when a system is uncertain, misconfigured, or under error conditions, it should default to a safe state rather than an open or permissive one. The predictable failure mode it prevents is accidental exposure due to mistakes, such as a misapplied rule, a missing check, or an unexpected input. For example, if access rules cannot be evaluated, the safer default is to deny access until the rules are confirmed, rather than allowing access because the system is confused. Beginners sometimes worry that fail-safe defaults will harm availability, and sometimes there is a trade-off, but the structural goal is to avoid catastrophic outcomes caused by small errors. A system that fails open can leak data or allow unauthorized actions in the exact moments when it is least stable. Exam questions that involve misconfigurations, degraded modes, or partial failures often have strong answers that emphasize fail-safe behavior and clear handling of error conditions. This principle is also a reminder that security is about designing for human mistakes, not assuming perfect operation. Another structural principle is complete mediation, which means every access request is checked against the access rules, rather than assuming that a past check is still valid forever. This prevents the predictable failure mode, where someone gains access once and then keeps it even when conditions change, such as role changes, session hijacking, or policy updates. Complete mediation is especially important in systems where sessions exist, where tokens are used, or where components call other components, because it is easy to accidentally create trusted shortcuts. Beginners often assume that if authentication happens at login, the system is safe, but authorization must be enforced continuously and consistently. Structurally, complete mediation supports accountability because each access can be tied to a policy decision and, when designed well, to logs that can be reviewed. Exam scenarios that involve stale permissions, privilege creep, or inconsistent enforcement often reveal a lack of complete mediation. When you see an option that enforces checks at the point of access rather than trusting a previous state, it is often aligned with strong structural design. Least common mechanism is a principle that helps prevent failures that come from shared infrastructure being overused or overtrusted. It means you minimize the amount of mechanism shared by multiple users or components, especially when the shared part becomes a pathway for interference. The predictable failure mode it prevents is cross-impact, where one component can affect another because they share too much, such as shared accounts, shared services, or shared storage paths without clear isolation. Shared mechanisms can create hidden coupling, and hidden coupling is a common reason security incidents spread faster than expected. Structurally, reducing shared mechanisms encourages isolation and clearer boundaries, which also improves reliability and maintainability. Beginners sometimes think sharing is always efficient, but in security engineering, efficiency that creates uncontrolled coupling can be a long-term risk. Exam questions about multi-tenant environments, shared administrative tools, or cross-system integration often benefit from this principle because it highlights the need for isolation. When an option reduces shared pathways and increases separation, it often reduces predictable risk. Open design is another principle that is often misunderstood because it can sound like it is about making everything public, when it is actually about not relying on secrecy of design to achieve security. Open design means the system should remain secure even if the attacker understands how it is built, because the protection should come from well-designed controls and protected secrets like keys, not from hiding the mechanism. The predictable failure mode it prevents is fragile security that collapses when the design is discovered, which happens frequently because designs leak through documentation, reverse engineering, or simple observation. Beginners sometimes feel that secrecy is safer, but secrecy often creates a false sense of confidence and discourages rigorous review. Structural security is stronger when it assumes attackers can learn about the system and still cannot bypass controls. On an exam, when you see answers that rely on hiding details as the primary protection, they are often weaker than answers that rely on robust controls and well-managed secrets. Open design supports assurance because it encourages review, testing, and evidence rather than faith. Psychological acceptability is a principle that connects security design to human behavior, and it prevents predictable failures caused by users working around controls. It means security mechanisms should be usable and aligned with how people actually work, so that security does not become a constant obstacle. The predictable failure mode it prevents is the workaround, like users sharing passwords, storing secrets unsafely, or bypassing procedures because the secure path is too painful. This is structural because it influences design choices, such as how authentication is integrated, how permissions are requested, and how alerts are presented to operators. Beginners sometimes treat usability as a separate concern, but security that is not usable is often not real security because it will be ignored in practice. Exam questions may describe environments where controls exist but are routinely bypassed, and the best response may involve designing security to fit workflows and reducing incentives to circumvent protections. This principle does not mean making security weak to make it easy. It means designing it so the secure path is the natural path. To connect these principles to predictable failure modes, it helps to recognize that many failures are not one-off accidents, but repeatable patterns that appear in many systems. Overly broad privileges lead to widespread compromise. Missing separation leads to unchecked abuse. Single-layer defenses lead to catastrophic bypass. Failing open leads to accidental exposure. Inconsistent checks lead to privilege persistence. Shared mechanisms lead to cross-impact. Secrecy-based designs lead to fragile protection, and unusable controls lead to workarounds. Structural principles are essentially your toolkit for reducing these patterns before you see them in production. When you apply them during requirements and design, you reduce the chance of ending up in a reactive cycle where you patch symptoms repeatedly. On the exam, when a scenario describes a failure, ask yourself which structural principle would have reduced the likelihood or limited the impact. That question often points you toward the most defensible answer because it addresses the underlying structure rather than a single surface-level fix. As we close, remember that structural security design principles are valuable because they help you build systems that are resilient against both attackers and normal operational imperfections. They guide you to reduce unnecessary trust through least privilege and complete mediation, to prevent concentrated power through separation of duties, and to avoid catastrophic dependence through defense in depth. They shape safer behavior under failure through fail-safe defaults and reduce hidden coupling through least common mechanism. They encourage robust protection through open design and practical effectiveness through psychological acceptability, because humans are part of every system. When you learn to see these principles as responses to predictable failure modes, you gain a way to reason quickly and confidently, even when a scenario is unfamiliar. The exam is not looking for you to recite a list. It is looking for you to recognize which principle best fits the problem and why it reduces risk in a defensible way. If you can do that, you are thinking like a security engineer who designs for reality, not like someone who just reacts after failure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.